The question was, compare how poets present ideas about conflict in Bayonet Charge and one other poem. We are going to look at a 30 out of 30 answer from a student, Isum Arachige. I probably pronounced that incorrectly, but he is brilliant. Let's begin with his plan. The first thing you'll notice is it is scrappy. The plan is just for him, not for the examiner, and he doesn't score any marks until he starts writing the actual essay. So he scraps away at it super quickly. The second thing to notice is that he is zoomed in on his favourite poem, Exposure. And this is the one he's going to emphasise most in his answer because he knows exactly what he wants to write about this poem. He's prepared it in advance. So Isum has gone into the exam knowing about 4 poems in super detail, and he's picked those 4 because they will meet whatever question comes up. Exposure, perfect match with Bayonet Charge, he's away. Do you have to choose poems that exactly match the poem that's named in the question paper? No. This is what the examiner report says. Quite a few students chose Storm on the Island, or Checking Out My History, or Lundian, or Ozymandias. None of these are war poems, yet they were able to compare the idea of conflict. Examiners saw some really empathic responses to the Agard poem. They were particularly impressed that students were able to link Bayonet Charge to Checking Out My History. And this is one of the reasons that happened. I released my prediction video saying I think it's going to be on Checking Out My History. I was wrong, but I knew I would probably be wrong. So in the video, I showed how you could apply what I taught you about Checking Out My History to any poem that could come up. So, prepare your poems and adapt them whatever the question. You don't have to find an exact match. The third thing I'd like you to think about is how much you have to write. So you can see that Isum's handwriting here is fast and it's not always perfectly legible. I'm just going to scroll through so you can see how much he writes. It keeps going and going, and I typed this up to find out how many words it was. 1,135 words. I have read literally hundreds of grade 9 essays, and their average is usually over 900 words long. The fourth thing to learn is a good thesis statement. I teach students to have 3 big ideas in their thesis statement, and Isum has 4. 1, it conveys the ruthless nature of conflict. 2, it's physically demanding. 3, it's psychologically demanding and therefore traumatic. And then 4, both poets try to expose the falsities of propaganda of war. 4 big ideas that Isum is going to prove in his essay. The examiner knows straight away that this is at least thoughtful, which is where grade 7 and 8 are, or is going to be convincing, which is where grade 9 is. Not only has the examiner made up their mind, but this now acts as an essay plan for Isum. Point number 5 is to start with the poem you have already prepared. In Isum's case, that was Exposure. The reason, well, there were 2 reasons to start with the one that you've already prepared. The first is about the speed with which you tackle the exam. Because Isum's already prepared what he wants to say about Exposure, he doesn't have to think. He knows he can just blitz in with what he wants to say. He's practiced it before at home, and he's memorised not just the quotes, but the analysis and the terminology that goes with it. So, for example, he knows that he wants to write about the personification, and that's easy because he's already prepared which quote he's going to use. He makes sure he links that back to his thesis statement straight away, showing how war is both physically and mentally demanding. The 6th thing I want to teach you is about the structure that Isum is using here for his essay. He makes a point about Exposure, and then he goes to compare it to Bayonet Charge. This is in fact the structure I used to teach, because it made sure that I was always comparing. However, since I've become more experienced in this question, I've realised 2 things. Number 1, The examiners don't say how much you have to compare. In other words, they're quite happy for you to write more about one poem than the other. So actually, if Issam wrote more about the poem he's prepared, exposure, he would find it even easier to get top marks. We're unfortunate here that Issam is a fantastic student, so he's able to do this really difficult thing of comparing paragraph by paragraph, poem by poem, each time he makes a point. And that brings me to my second point. It takes a lot of brain power to think about the exact matches for the comparison, to flip from one poem to the other all the way through. It takes a lot less brain power just to write about one poem and then write everything you need about the second poem, comparing back as you go. That's much easier, and that means if you're not a natural grade 9 student, you can still get grade 9 because you don't have to think as hard to do it. However, this experience is different to Bayonet Charge, as Owen recounts a first-hand experience of war as a soldier who fought in the trenches, whereas Hughes's father was a soldier, not him. Now, interestingly, that level of context isn't something that the examiner wants to give marks to. It's the next bit. Perhaps why the soldier in Bayonet Charge is portrayed to be slightly more heroic. The almost violent adjective merciless perhaps conveys a sense of sadism in the nature, as the soldiers feel as if they're being knived. This harsh verb portrays the soldier's pure pain and agony and evokes the harsh reality of war. So this is where Issam goes back to his thesis statement, and this is where the marks are scored. Notice the bit that scored marks is the bit that came from exposure, and it's the same with this paragraph. Furthermore, the half rhymes, salient and silent, could mimic a lack of cohesion war brings, not only for the soldiers' physical state, but also to their minds, which is further emphasized as Owen uses a range of metric feet, which mimics the chaotic nature of war. Now, this is a really interesting paragraph. Remember, Issam wrote over 1,100 words. This is actually a paragraph that scores no marks. So you might be saying, whoa, Mr. Salles, hang on just a cotton-picking minute. Doesn't the top of the mark range say you've got to write about form and structure, and isn't this how Issam is gaining marks? Yes and no. You do have to write about those things, but you have to link them to meaning in order to be convincing. This is what the examiner's report to this question said. Lists of structural features and their technical names, often merely described rather than related to meaning, or without precise references to the poems, are not the best use of time. Here's the clincher. That said, discussion of some structural features can achieve highly, for instance, the effects of openings and last lines. How amazing is that? You don't need some special terminology. You don't need to look at the rhyme scheme. You just need to say why the poet begins the poem in a particular way or ends it in a particular way, and that is enough for looking at the structure of the poem. Look at what else the examiner says. Writing about the rhyme scheme is best avoided. Comments on poetic construction could be limiting. When discussing Bayonet Charge, for example, there were frequent references to enjambment and caesura, students cramming in the subject terminology. This is not per se wrong, so you can write something sensible about those things, but what they're pointing out is most students just don't know how to. And similarly, writing about the flow or the pace of the poem is completely meaningless. So the examiner is saying, don't write anything about the structure unless you can tie it to the meaning. Issam has tried to link it to meaning. He's saying that the different metrical feet, you might not even know what that is, but I'm ignoring it because it's not scoring any marks, but he's saying it mimics the chaotic nature of war. But that's just random. You could say it mimicked anything that isn't completely regular. If we quickly zoom back to the original paper, you can see that the annotations have nothing to do with these points. This one was about the analysis of merciless, this one about the analysis of knived, and the bit that we're reading now typed up is here. No annotation from the examiner at all because they think it's waffle. The examiner is going to get excited again with some further analysis later on feeling and fingering, again from Exposure, the poem that Issam has prepared. In other words, it's your analysis of language which is going to get you the grades. The analysis of form and structure is a distraction that you could pretty much avoid. Here is a structure point that does score marks. Similarly, Hughes also structures his poem to convey the restless nature of conflict as he starts in media res. So this is how the poem starts, and now to get the mark, why it starts that way. It is to illustrate that his experience is also one of many and that soldiers cannot rest in conflict. Linked to meaning, it gets the marks. Furthermore, the enjambment of raw in raw further depicts the sense of unstoppable action, as the sweat is also metaphorically heavy. So this does score a mark because it's linked to meaning, although actually what does emphasize the heaviness is the repetition and not the enjambment. Now we have two further comments about the structure. This is similar to Exposure. However, in Exposure we feel a sense of injured pain between the soldier through the personal pronoun we and the regular 8-line stanzas, demonstrating that all the soldiers are equally harmed by the weather. So that is a valid interpretation of we. It means all of us are harmed in the same way. The comment about the regular 8-line stanzas, completely meaningless. Regular stanzas could have conveyed anything. And remember, he was talking about the metric feet being chaotic. It doesn't matter because both comments are equally waffly, and the examiner doesn't take marks away, they just ignore the waffle. Whereas in Bayonet Charge, it's only describing one soldier, perhaps being more universal, as he didn't fight in the war. Moreover, both poems metaphorically convey nature in conflict in different ways. And so this brings me to point number 8. Teachers are absolutely obsessed that AQA will one day ask a question about the power or the conflict in nature, and consequently students get prepared in this in all sorts of different ways. Yet I don't think AQA has ever asked that question. Issam's genius here is to think, well, I've blooming well revised this and I've blooming well prepared it, so I'm going to use it in my answer. And that is absolutely the right way to do it. Take what you know, as long as it's a really good analysis, and see how you can fit it into the flipping question. But actually, it's only worth doing if you've practiced making it fit. Now, this bit, remember, was the one with the level 6 annotation from the examiner, because it's about the fingering and the feeling. So let's find out what that is before YouTube cancels me. Moreover, both poems metaphorically convey nature in conflict in different ways. In Exposure, nature is conveyed to be ruthless, as pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. An immediate sense of pain from nature is mimicked by the fricatives. Fricatives is the repetition of F at the beginning of words here. And the uncomfortable verb feeling and the awkward adjective fingering simply suggests how helpless the soldiers feel in conflict. Remember, you have to link it to meaning, and that's what's happened here, and that's why he's scored the mark. He's memorized the terminology, fricatives, that he wants to use. He knows he wants to write about nature, but he needs to make it relevant to his thesis statement, which, remember, included physical and psychological pain. So there it is. This approach is money in the bank. He knows he's got a range of things he's going to say about Exposure, and come hell or high water, no matter what, he's practiced to make them relevant to any question, so he knows going into the exam, this will fit. In contrast, Hughes portrays nature as powerful in conflict, as the furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. The graphic imagery similarly demonstrates how violent the nature of conflict is, as the harsh verb through almost contrasts the innocent rolling hair, implying that conflict is unsympathetic even to innocent hairs. So not bad, although actually It's much worse that this conflict is terrible towards the soldiers, but never mind. This is further portrayed through the simile rolled like a flame, which conveys the immense suffering of nature and simply suggests the fact that war is merciless, just like exposure. So this is an example of where that technique hasn't quite gone right, because he's looking for nature in bayonet charge and he hasn't prepared the bayonet charge comment properly. Because really this paragraph seems to be arguing that the effect of conflict on nature is just as bad or worse than the effect on men, and I don't think that's what the poem's about. The examiner's report actually commented on the fact that so many students tried to write about conflict in nature. I told you teachers were obsessed, and they had some really useful stuff to say. The other image which students wrestled with was the yellow hair. Some saw the hair as a symbol of nature, and thus further evidence of the war on nature and its destruction. So this is the least impressive. Now you can see the examiner moves on to more impressive. Some perceptive students went on to link this to the shot/slashed furrows, identifying the difference between ploughed fields and those savaged by the bullets. That's more perceptive because it's now linking the bullets to the killing of men. And then they go to a further perceptive comment. Some students saw the hair as a symbol of death, supported by the gruesome description of the open mouth and staring eyes. So now the hair isn't just a symbol of nature itself, it's obviously a symbol about death coming to the men as well. That's why the examiners prefer this interpretation. Issam is going to write a lot of waffle about this, but he'll get away with it because he's writing so many extra words at 1100. Issam gets this slightly wrong. Issam continues, these feelings with nature are perhaps conveyed as Hughes grew up in a rural Yorkshire and grew up around nature, so conveying nature in this way would be shocking, and consequently he portrays war as heartless. Well, hopefully you can already see why this is gibberish. Bayonet charge isn't really about nature, and you can't pretend it is. It includes nature in its attack on the severity and horrors of war. And saying that Hughes is writing about nature in war because he grew up in the countryside, completely spurious. Earns no marks. You've probably noticed that this essay is published in my weekly newsletter. It's totally free, link is in the description. So let's now look at point number 9. How do you earn marks with a good analysis of symbolism? Moreover, both poets convey conflict as monotonous and almost slowing down time. In Bayonet Charge, Hughes rhetorically asks, in what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was the hand pointing this seconds? Initially, the plosive consonance in cold clockwork not only conveys the sorrowful nature of war, but also demonstrates how the soldier realizes that his life is so meagre and perhaps meaningless. These feelings are perhaps feelings of nihilism. So this is a really strong analysis of the symbol of this clock and the soldier as being like the ticking hand. Then there is the rather useless bit that scores no marks, and the mechanical imagery used could reflect Hughes's history as a mechanic. No. It could equally reflect that he owned a clock. That bit is not meaningful context. That brings us to point 10. What does meaningful context look like? Well, this is what the examiners say. The focus on ideas about conflict was quite straightforward. In the question it means patriotism, violence, death, inner conflict, PTSD, amongst others, were appropriate considerations for AO3 context. In other words, the context is in the poem itself. You don't have to find context about the poet's life. So they added paragraphs, for example, about Owen's war experiences, or Hugh's father as a soldier, or extraneous information about Guardsman Tromans, I know nothing about him, were not useful if they meant losing sight of the poem. And what the examiner is saying there is you don't need any of that in order to get top marks. The context is the issue being dealt with in the poems. That's really reassuring because it makes it much easier to get top grades. So now it's time to see how Issam gets that right. This dehumanization is also felt by the soldiers in Exposure. However, Owen portrays more openly nihilistic feelings of conflict, also rhetorically, through "Is it that we are dying?" Not only does he think the soldiers are dying, but Owen also suggests the brutality of conflict, remember that's in his thesis statement, as he suggests that God is not helping and the love of God seems dying. This is particularly important as Owen was raised a devout Christian and even worked as a vicar. So this could be meaningless context. If it's linked to the meaning of the poem, he's going to get the mark. However, through war, he becomes disillusioned with God, which could suggest how his trust in God has been destroyed through conflict, leading to his realization. Okay, now that is linked to the meaning of the poem. It gets the mark for appropriate context. He also ends some of his stanzas with the refrain, "But nothing happens," with the consequence that it juxtaposes all the detailed language previously, and Owen conveys the monotony of war. Also, nothing is happening whilst they suffer through pain. Alternatively, Owen could be suggesting that they are not dying even though they want to, perhaps even reflecting the suicidal thoughts of soldiers at the time. So this is a structural point, but nothing happens is at the end of the stanzas. Why is it there? It's in order to emphasize the thoughts of the soldiers. So this is a really good interpretation. Notice again that he keeps coming back to his analysis of Exposure in order to gain the highest marks, because this is the poem he's prepared in advance. Furthermore, in Exposure, guns and weapons in conflict are combined as dangerously painful. He describes sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, in which the violence is reflected by the immense sibilance. These very graphic descriptions of not only bullets but also nature could be symptoms of his condition with PTSD. Remember, that is an aspect of context that the examiner was happy with, which is a shame because PTSD didn't get invented until 1980. Prior to that it was called shell shock, so you're going to get even more marks by calling it that, but I'll let that slide. As he cannot forget his profound memories from conflict, and consequently, after meeting Siegfried Sassoon, also diagnosed with PTSD, he wanted to shine light on the condition and give it more medical attention than it did not receive. So this bit is dodgy context. Issam gets away with it because it is linked to meaning, but actually this is an anti-war poem. It's not really about PTSD. It's much more about how people were slaughtered on the battlefield and that they were too ill-equipped for the weather, so that they then also die of exposure, and what's worse, the people at home don't seem to care. So that analysis is obviously much more detailed and perceptive than just saying, yep, he didn't like the idea of PTSD. But again, because Issam is writing 1100 words, he knows that enough of his points are going to score top marks. However, these ideas of weapons in conflict contrast in Bayonet Charge, as he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. The adjective numb could have a duality in it, as not only does he lug the rifle so hard that it metaphorically becomes numb, but he could also represent the numbness of the soldiers as they casually shoot and fire with no thought. This is an excellent analysis of symbolism. This comes from the examiner's report again. Dealing with the cold clockwork of the stars and the nations produced a huge range of ideas. The soldier's heart had become cold. The soldier was the hand pointing out the futility of the war. The stars and nations were referencing patriotism. Particularly successful interpretations were those where the soldier was becoming a robotic, unthinking weapon of war. This was further supported by the rifle, numb as a smashed arm, simply being so much a part of him that it replaced his arm. And so that's what we've just seen. This idea of the unthinking weapon is exactly what Issam has told us. Other ideas about the rifle reference pursued the idea that the soldier was refusing to fight any longer, sometimes linked to lugged, suggesting a metaphorical reluctance to carry the weight. And this is what I mean by having more than one interpretation of a quote. Point number 11, it's really useful to have more than one interpretation of some quotes. You only have to do this once or twice. You don't want it all the way through your essay because you'll never get to the end. But once or twice is going to show really in-depth, convincing analysis. These actions portrayed the indoctrination of soldiers at the time as propaganda was being used to brainwash even young 15 to 16-year-olds into joining the army, and both Hughes and Owens try to convey this. Well, normally I'd say this is pointless context, but it does link back to the idea of numbness, and so we can just about allow it. However, in Exposure, the harsh reality of conflict is conveyed more as the soldiers being tortured whilst doing nothing in the trenches, whereas in Bayonet Charge the soldier is in action and feels in a conflict. However, similar feelings with the bullets are portrayed as bullets are punching the belly out of the air, metaphorically. Hughes uses auditory imagery of the bullets personifically smacking the air to convey conflict as brutal. So, not a very well written paragraph, but he's rushing to get to the end, because he's writing so much. Let's now read the conclusion. In conclusion, both poets convey conflict as negative. They both want to expose the propaganda at the time as fake, and that soldiers should not be forced into going into war without knowing what they're going into. Hughes had a turbulent time with his wives committed suicide, pointless context, and Owen fought in the trenches, so both poets reflected their disdain and pain towards conflict in these poems. The last line is getting the marks. Now, the crucial thing to remember here is where I started, by telling you that the average top grade essay is at least 900 words long. Issam's is over 1100 words long because he includes a load of waffle. But now you know what waffle not to include, you can start practicing how to apply the 4 favourite poems that you've studied to any single question and then blitz them out in an essay. Exposure is probably the best poem to choose, and so my in-depth analysis of that is the video coming up next.